Cannock Chase is an area of countryside in Staffordshire, England. An unusual amount of strange things have happened in this area to the point that I am surprised that I've never heard of it before with the amount of dark topics I enjoy learning about. We'll briefly discuss the paranormal occurrences before going into the true crime cases of the area. In 1964, the Cannock Chase area made headlines after witnesses claimed a UFO had crashed in the field near the town of Penkridge. 3 small extraterrestrial beings were allegedly found after the crash, but the Army and NATO tried to keep the incident secret at all costs. A local witness, Harold South, claimed to have seen the entire event. As he drove past the field, the man swore he saw soldiers loading the crashed UFO covered by a waterproof jacket onto a transporter. He allegedly managed to take some photos, but they were confiscated by the British Air Force. The public learned about the details of the case only in 1991 when a former member of the U.S. Air Force, Leonard Stringfield, spoke. He claimed that the UFO was observed moving erratically over European territory. Most of the UFO fell in Cannock Chase, where a smaller part continued its sporadic flight and ended up somewhere in German territory. Locals have since seen frequent sightings of UFOs over Cannock Chase. The case remained unsolved and is nicknamed British Roswell. Big cats have been spotted in the forest many times, the most famous stories being the panther of Cannock Chase, which is unusual as big cats do not live in the United Kingdom. Witnesses saw a large black animal crawling across the landscape. In 2008, the mutilated corpses of several red deer, which would have been prey of big cats, were found in the forest. A woman also claimed to have seen a large black cat in a German cemetery, but it suddenly disappeared with a sound of static electricity, leading to speculation that the creature was not flesh and blood at all. Some people claim to have encountered a large red-eyed creature in the woods of Cannock Chase that looked a lot like American Bigfoot. The legend from 1879 told of a man who was walking his horse along the road late at night, but when he reached a bridge, a large dark creature suddenly jumped out of the field and attacked his horse. The man wanted to hit the creature with his whip, but the whip passed through the creature like a ghost. The incident spread among the locals, and some started calling the creature the Monkey Man. In February 1995, a woman named Jackie Hauntington nearly hit a large humanoid creature with red eyes while driving along the Cannock Chase ruggly road. The legends of Cannock Chase continue with the story of the Hellhound, this large black dog with glowing eyes and pointed ears. People have seen sneaking along the road. Sightings were frequent, especially in the 1970s and 1980s. Nigel Lee was driving his car on a remote road through the woods in 1972 when he noticed a ball of light on the road. As he slowed down and got closer, he saw the absolute biggest dog he had ever seen. A month later, an acquaintance of his lost his life in an accident that may have had something to do with the Hellhound, whose presence is said to announce an incoming demise. In 1985, another testimony of a demonic dog was published by Sylvia Everett. She was traveling in the woods with her husband one summer evening when she noticed a strange, misty figure moving along the road. The witnesses could not explain the phenomenon. In 2007, reports appeared in local newspapers about a group of wolf creatures that stand on its hind legs in broad daylight at the German cemetery, and moments later flee into the woods. Several other people then came forward with sightings of the wolf suddenly rising on its hind legs and running away, leading to rumors of a werewolf. Over the following years, a number of residents' pets also disappeared from around the cemetery, which only strengthened the legends. In addition to strange creatures, Cannock Chase also boasts classic ghost stories, often centered on the 2,000-year-old fortress, the history of which included rituals and sacrifices. Witnesses often speak of both dark and light figures roaming the area. Strange sounds such as hammer blows, singing, or ancient music are also common. In 2006, the unusual story of a lady from Chase resurfaced. A woman named Linda was driving home at night when the figure of a woman appeared in front of her in the middle of the road. Linda said the woman had gray skin and was naked, but she did not see any signs of genitals. The mysterious woman looked at Linda with big hypnotic eyes for a moment. The witness was paralyzed and unable to react at that moment. One of the strangest legends is the story of Pigman, a 2-meter tall humanoid in farmer's clothes with a pig snout and a terrible screaming voice. Sightings are said to date back to the 1940s, but in this case the stories sound exaggerated and more like modern folklore. Unfortunately, there's no photographic or other evidence of the various legends. However, some of the stories go back over 100 years, so it's probably not just a tourist attraction. One possible explanation for the concentration of so much paranormal activity in such a small place could be some sort of gateway from other dimensions where unknown creatures we cannot understand live and pass through. I wouldn't suggest any of it is likely, but it is still interesting. But we still have one more entity to talk about. Hang in with me or skip to the true crime stories. I don't care. Regardless, I find this story interesting even if it is just a story. In June 2001, Mike Johnson, an ecologist, was in Cannock Chase to work on a project revolving around a local plant. Mike came into the area near the old German cemetery and parked his car there. It was 2 p.m. and a warm, clear day with barely a cloud in the sky, and he was heading towards an area that was once a plantation forest that had been cut down. He noticed that the forest was particularly quiet that day. There was an intense silence over the forest that Mike found quite strange. There were no sounds of birds or insects, and even the sound of vehicles passing by the area was almost non-existent, but Mike didn't think too much of it in the moment and just continued on his way. As he headed toward the trail where the plantation he was studying used to be, he noticed a herd of about 50 deer suddenly appear on a nearby ridge. He smiled at the sight as he happened to only see a few deer. On occasion, he watched as the herd seemed to run towards the large plantation to Mike's right. It was as if they were running away from someone. As Mike continued on his way, a terrible thought popped into his head. This area felt wrong indeed. When he looked around, he could not tell where he was. The path he had taken from the cemetery was seemingly to the west to him when it was now to the east, and when he looked up at the sky, even the sun seemed to be in the wrong direction. For though it should have been high in the west, it was now directly north. Even some of the landmarks were gone. When the ridge was in its original position, the entirety of the southern area was now to the west, almost as if someone took away part of the area and moved the sun. The fact that he seemed to be lost was strange to him because he had walked these paths many times before. He located the sun and took out his map to find out where he was. Looking at the map he had brought with him to see if he could find the trail he was on, he soon realized that this trail he should have taken was only 700 meters from his car. It was not the road he was on. The landmarks were gone, and the general shape of the trail did not match that of his map. He then reached down and tried to use his compass to find his way back, but as he looked for the needle to turn to magnetic north, he just watched in confusion as his compass needle stayed still, looking around the area. He also had the feeling that something was wrong as it became uncomfortably quiet, and an unsettling feeling permeated the air. He noticed this even though the environment around him seemingly changed. He was not alone because he could already see 3 elderly hikers from a distance. Seeing this potential help, he decided to wait for the group to approach him so he could ask them for directions. He waited 10 minutes for the group to approach, and when they got about 500 meters away, he could get a good look at them and hear everything he said. The trio of nature enthusiasts were in their 50s and 60s, which I personally don't think is old enough for them to be considered elderly, and consisted of a tall man and 2 women with waterproof jackets tied around their waists. He watched them as they approached when something extraordinary happened. They seemed to disappear. Mike couldn't believe what he had just seen. He stood at the place they were and could only guess that they had popped out of existence. He tried to explain what he had seen, feeling that perhaps they had walked down an unseen ravine and naturally disappeared from view. So Mike scanned the area for several minutes, waiting for their heads to pop out of the grass, but they didn't appear from the direction he had thought. Instead, the group reappeared about 200 meters to his left, but as he looked, he noticed that there was something else about the group. Behind them, there seemed to be a fourth figure. It was a relatively short distance, but still identified compared to the other three figures. It seemed to move when the group moved and stopped when they stopped, and each time it did, the figure got closer and closer till Mike realized the person behind them was not normal. As he looked, he noticed that the figure was wearing gray pants and a tight, long-sleeve shirt. It was incredibly tall with long, thin arms. Looking at the group, he noticed that the figure was now incredibly close to them and it towered over them. He realized that this was no ordinary person, estimating the figure to be well over 9 feet tall. Craning his neck upwards and looking at the huge man, he noticed that the man was unnaturally pale and had an incredibly long, thin neck and a slightly elongated head. Looking at the head, he noticed that there was no hair and only glistening skin. As he concentrated on the head, he came to the shocking realization that it had no facial features, no eyes, mouth, nose, or ears. Just absolute blankness. As he looked at the body, he realized that while he initially thought the arms were long, he now realized that the arms actually hung down almost beyond the knees. Seeing this well-dressed being with the group of disappearing hikers was rather strange, but Mike soon realized that the creature and the hikers, interestingly enough, were unaware of each other's existence. Mike felt it for sure after a moment when the hikers stopped. The figure was a little behind them now, and as one of the women reached for her water bottle and began to drink, the creature reached its long arms across the grass and grabbed her shoulder. The woman continued to drink and chat with her friends, apparently not noticing the figure behind her. Mike sensed that the creature was still aware of him as the figure turned its head to look at him, and that the grip on the shoulder was the creature protecting the woman and possibly the rest of the group from him. It was then when Mike felt extremely confused, me too, and began to lean towards the backpack in front of him on the ground, and he had every intention of approaching the group, but when he looked up, bag in hand, the environment was back to how it was before. The sun returned to its place in the west, and all the landmarks he had known before returned to their assigned places. The overwhelming confusion and uncertainty disappeared, and so did the oppressive feeling. As the place seemed to return to normal, so did the sounds of nature return to chirping of birds, as well as sounds of cars zooming by. In front of him was a path to the German cemetery, and he saw a large German shepherd running down it, followed by a group of children and adults. Now that he found a way out, he ran down the path, jumped into his car, and drove off, never to return to the area. Although Mike would never encounter this sinister figure again, he still had the strange feelings in the forest. A year later, in 2002, near Loch Grayton in Scotland, Mike again felt that something was wrong in the forest around the lake. He felt a strange tingling and a very similar feeling of confusion rise up his back and he couldn't find a clear direction, but it happened pretty quickly and he got out of the area without a problem. Mike would tell his experience to British 14 researcher Nick Redfern in 2007, and his account appeared in Redfern's book There's Something Strange in the Woods. Several years later, Slender Man was invented, and Redfern couldn't help but notice the striking resemblance between the fictional internet creature and the entity Mike had seen. Redfern would later collect other reports from all over the United States and England, which along with Mike's encounter would appear in one of the only books on the subject of the Slenderman phenomenon. Slenderman is a creation of fiction. The suggestion is there is an entity similar to it that people have seen even before Slenderman was created online. British paranormal investigator Lee Brickley spent a lot of time researching the Cannock Chase area and wrote several books on the subject, and from late 2014 to early 2015 he made several reports about what he believed to be an entity similar to Slenderman. However, these sightings were very different from Mike's experience. The first sighting mentioned by Lee was January 2nd, 2015 in the Cannock Chase area. It was late at night when a witness who was there saw a strange figure on the edge of the fortress that frequents ghost sightings I mentioned a couple minutes ago. He wasn't sure if it was another guest there, but watched in horror as the figure rose from the ground and began to float in the air. Doesn't sound like Slenderman. The sky was completely clear of clouds and full of stars, so he could make out the figure clearly. It wore an old black hat and dark cloak. Again, not like Slenderman. I don't understand the connection. Its eyes glowed bright red and its mouth was full of sharp teeth. As the witness watched this anomaly in the air, he saw it looking at him and flying towards him with superhuman speed. The witness was afraid the creature would hit him and ducked to the ground as it flew overhead. It landed in the nearby trees and the witness ran out of there. I have no idea why this is classified as similar to Slenderman. Seems to be a flying humanoid, which I also have a video on. In Lee's interview, the witness mentioned one thing about the whole thing that seems to take it to a new level of weirdness was the figure closely resembled the infamous paranormal creature that belched blue flames and terrorized England in the mid-19th century, namely Spring-Heeled Jack. The next sighting that Lee associates with Slenderman, for whatever reason, just makes it sound even less believable to associate it with a fictional character, happened at 2 a.m. also in 2015. The witness to this sighting was lying asleep in bed when she was suddenly awakened by strange scratching sounds that seemed to come from her open closet. As she looked into the dark abyss, she noticed a spherical shadow hovering on the ground. The dark orb, which seemed aware that it had been noticed, began to change shape as it began to transform into an 8-foot-tall, pale humanoid. Twice the length of a traditional human and approach her. The creature's claws ran across her face, making her scream, and at the sound, the creature retreated back into the shadows from where it came and disappeared. The last incident that happened similarly at 2:30 a.m. and also near Cannock Chase where there was a similar bedroom intruder. The witness was awakened that night by a loud noise coming from his bedroom, and looking around the room, he saw a humanoid figure hovering over his bed, looking at him maliciously with fiery red eyes. The creature was dressed in all black, and the witness claimed that the creature spoke to him telepathically, but what was said was not disclosed. However, that haunting apparition soon left the man shortly after, floating up towards the ceiling, disappearing. The witness then did not sleep all night, which is expected and wasn't that necessary to conclude in the report. The Cannock Chase murder, also known as Babes in the Ditch murder, were the murders of 3 girls aged between 5 and 7 that occurred in Staffordshire, England. All 3 children were discovered in Cannock Chase, a vast area of countryside in Staffordshire. At 9 p.m. on December 2nd, 1964, a 9-year-old Julia Taylor was lured into a blue car by a man who claimed to be her mother's friend and called himself Uncle Len. The child was told that her mother asked the person to drive her to her aunt's house to pick up Christmas presents. She was driven to a desolate area where you can guess what the man did to her. He also put his hands around her neck. She was thrown half undressed from the car into a ditch, suffering severe internal injuries. Taylor was found alive by a passing cyclist about 50 minutes later. Taylor was found alive by a passing cyclist about 50 minutes later. This individual later reported hearing low whining sounds while cycling in the pouring rain and in dark, and stopped his bike to investigate the noise. The cyclist immediately waved down a passing van that took the crying and child to the hospital. If the cyclist hadn't heard and seen the child in the ditch, Julia would have likely passed within 20 minutes. Julia could remember little about this traumatic event, her abductor, or his vehicle, except crying and begging her captor to drive her home when she noticed that he was passing her aunt's house, and this conversation suddenly became more violent. However, one eyewitness to Julia's abduction was certain that the kidnapper's vehicle was a large car with 2-tone paint, small fins on the rear, and a flashlight mounted on the windshield near the driver's door. Despite intensive efforts to locate this car, the vehicle was never found. On the afternoon of Wednesday, September 8th, 1965, a 6-year-old girl, Margaret Reynolds, went missing near her home on Clifton Road, Aston, as she walked the short distance from her home to Prince Albert Elementary School. Her older sister Susan last saw her alive when they left the group to walk in separate directions to their schools after returning home from lunch. When the child did not return home from school, the parents quickly realized that she had not attended classes that afternoon. The Reynolds immediately reported their daughter's disappearance to police. In the weeks following Reynolds' disappearance, 160 police officers interviewed more than 25,000 people in and around Ashton. The Birmingham Evening Post printed 200 posters with a composite photograph of the child dressed in the clothes last seen, accompanied by an appeal for witnesses to contact the police. These posters were distributed in and around Ashton and neighboring towns. With the help of the public, investigators thoroughly searched every house and landmark within 8 miles of where Margaret was last seen alive. Despite these efforts, no trace of her was found in the months leading up to the abduction. Investigators received numerous reports of a lone man in a car in the vicinity of her disappearance who tried to lure teenage girls into his car, who, if successful, did what you can guess to them. 3 months later, on December 30th, a 5-year-old girl named Diana Joy Tiff disappeared in the street near her Walsall home. The child was last seen outside her grandmother's home on Chapel Street at 2 p.m. As she walked to her home, she was carrying a pink plastic handbag with a white plastic strap that she had got as a Christmas present. The last sighting of Diana was by a family member who believed she saw her pass a nearby laundromat on her way to the family home. Diana was reported missing by her parents at 7 p.m. As in the earlier case of Margaret Reynolds, despite extensive search, no trace of her was found. After Diana disappeared, about 2,000 officers from across the West Midlands region had been assigned to find Diana. Several senior officers also tentatively linked her disappearance to that of Margaret Reynolds. Over 6,000 homes, gardens, and outhouses in and around the area were searched. Ponds and reservoirs were searched by underwater units. Other officers searched abandoned factories and warehouses to no avail. On the afternoon of January 12, 1966, a man hunting rabbits found the body of Diana Tiff. She lay hidden in the underground beside a flooded ditch in Cannock Chase. The site was rarely used farm track. An autopsy later revealed that what you can guess happened to her, and her jacket was pressed against her nose and mouth, causing her to pass away. It is truly despicable how someone can do these crimes without the feeling of disgust. It disgusts me to talk about these crimes committed against children. Surely you are disgusted listening to them. I may be ignorant, but I have hope that people who cause harms to others will not exist one day. Whether we can identify them before they commit the crimes and get rid of them, cure them, or prevent them from being born, I have hope. Margaret Reynolds' unclothed body lay only inches away. Her body was badly decomposed and her clothes were never recovered except for one shoe. Pathologists could not determine how she passed away other than traces of semen found on Diana. No forensic evidence was found at the crime scene. Before the children were found, police concluded that their abductions were related. The way Julia's abduction and body was disposed of in 1964 also led investigators to strongly link her abduction and the attempted taking of her life to the same criminal. At a press conference on January 13th, police told the media, "We are hunting a dangerous criminal who targets children who may strike again." The investigative team worked 14 hours a day, 7 days a week to catch the suspect. The filing system implemented to cross-check data gradually expanded to thousands. Many of the vehicles spotted in Mansley Gully between December 30th and the 12th of January were traced, their owners interviewed, and subsequently removed from the investigation following their whereabouts on crucial dates. The man who found the children, a poacher with a known history of violence, had also been ruled out as a suspect despite painstaking efforts over the following months, including extensive house-to-house inquiries. Police failed to identify the perpetrator. The August 1966 abduction of a 10-year-old girl named Jane Taylor, who disappeared in Mowbray while riding her bike, was also tentatively linked to the same perpetrator, as investigators could not discount the possibility her disappearance was connected to what were colloquially known as the A34 murders. By the summer of 1964, no further clues of substance were given to police to pursue, and the investigation had largely become cold. Although unable to identify the criminal, investigators felt certain the perpetrator would strike again. In preparation, a plan was devised of all minor and major exits in the vicinity of Walsall be closed within 20 minutes of any reported child abduction, with officers to be deployed upon all major roads to Cannock Chase. 3 neighboring police forces were also notified of this plan, with officers from their forces instructed of their required duties upon receiving the simple code word "stop" plan. At 2:30 p.m. on August 19th, 1967, 7-year-old Christine Darby was lured into a gray car as she played with her friends in her home in Walsall. The individual asked Christine and her friends if they knew the directions to Caldmore Green. When the children pointed in the direction, adding it was just a short distance up the road, he acted confused and asked Christine to get in the car and show him the way, promising to drive her back to her friends immediately afterward. The child, whose mother did not own a car, entered the vehicle excitedly. Her friends then observed the vehicle reverse, then speed in the opposite direction of Caldmore Green, the direction of Cannock Chase. Witnesses to Christine's abduction immediately ran to her home to report the incident to her mother. She, in turn, almost immediately ran to a payphone and notified police. With the assistance from neighboring police forces, the devised plan to install roadblocks at all roads exiting Walsall. When questioned by police, the witnesses to the abduction explained the man had been white, in his mid-30s, shaved, and had dark brown hair. He wore a white suit and drove a gray car and spoke in a local accent. One of the children, in particular, 7-year-old Nicholas, was convinced that the man pronounced Caldmore Green as Carmer Green and not Caldmore Green, as any local would. This information reinforced the police belief that the criminal was a local man. As a result, the police concentrated their search for the perpetrator in and around Walsall. Over the next few days, 24,000 pamphlets with Christine's photograph were distributed to the public and displayed in prominent places such as shop windows, bus stops, and telephone poles. A witness told police she saw a gray car heading towards Cannock Chase shortly after 2:30 p.m. on August 19th. According to witnesses, a dark-haired girl was sitting in the passenger seat. By the morning of August 20th, the police had begun an exhaustive search for the body of Christine Darby at Cannock Chase, with approximately 30% of Cannock Chase's 55 square kilometer area covered in spruce trees, dense foliage, mine shafts, clay pits, and foxholes. An area search of the landscape would be ineffective. As a result, more than 300 police officers began a foot search in Cannock Chase. These officers were soon assisted by more than 200 officers from neighboring forces and 250 soldiers. A few hours later, dirty children's underpants were found attached to a fallen tree branch. A sole of a child's shoe was found early the next morning in fern leaves 3 miles north of where the underpants were found. In the afternoon of August 22nd, Christine was found lifeless and unclothed in the forest, partially hidden by broken fern branches. The soldier who found her, Michael Blundred, immediately raised his right hand and asked his colleagues to stop the search. Christine was lying on her back on a small ridge between 2 rows of fir trees. She was undressed from the waist down, arms outstretched, legs apart, and knees raised. Beneath her body, red stained the grass and pine needles, indicating the crime was committed while she was lying there. Evidence of a hemorrhage on her face and neck, and her tongue extending slightly past the edge of her teeth suggested that she had passed from the criminal restricting her breathing. Her black pants were a few feet away. Her location was only a mile from where Diana and Margaret were found the previous year. All 3 children lived within 17 miles of each other and a short distance from the A34 road. Analysis of maggots found in her nostrils showed that she had passed 2 or 3 days before she was found. A detailed examination of the crime scene itself on the morning of August 23rd revealed fragmentary tire tracks identified as having been made by a family-sized saloon car close to where she was found. Those tire tracks ascended 140 meters from where she was found. It clearly showed that the criminal had driven into the forest, then reversed, deviating very little from the impressions formed on the drive. An expert was called in to help with the investigation, who said the driver had considerable skills and experience in driving. Investigators began identifying and eliminating all individuals and vehicles seen in Cannock Chase that afternoon. Over the following months, the owners of more than 600 vehicles were found and removed from the investigation. 2 people who were in Cannock Chase that afternoon told investigators they remembered a gray vehicle parked near where Christine was found. The vehicle in question was driven by a white man with dark hair. One of those witnesses, Victor Whitehouse, gave a detailed description of the man he saw leaning against the door of the vehicle he believed to be a Cambridge or Oxford sedan, parked where police found the vehicle's tire tracks. Whitehouse was sure he would recognize the man if he ever saw him again. Another witness, Janine Rawlings, saw the vehicle driving slowly in the area. She was certain the vehicle was an Austin Cambridge A60. In response to this information, the police launched an extreme pursuit of the vehicle. Over the following months, investigators viewed over 1 million records and 11 local tax offices and identified over 20,000 vehicles that needed to be traced. The owners of these vehicles were interviewed, and their alibis on the day of Christine's disappearance were reviewed, were confirmed as each successive vehicle was removed from the study. The investigators widened the search radius progressively interviewing more than 44,000 Austin A55 and A60 owners in and around the Midlands. A separate incident room was opened amid piles of paperwork dedicated to the case. This case room operated alongside the Walsall case room, which had previously been set up for the same suspect in the previous abductions, and each was staffed by around 200 officers. Direct telephone lines were installed between the two rooms, and both were equipped with CCTV so that investigators could quickly review documents stored in the separate room. With the help of Victor Whitehouse and Janine Rawlings, the police created and distributed color composites of the suspect's face. This is the first colorized facial composite used in British crime-fighting history. More than 2,000 copies of the composite were distributed across the country on September 5th. This gave the police several thousand more promising leads to investigate. In January 1968, a team of 200 detectives began further investigations of more than 54,000 houses in the Walsall district. Male members of each household between the ages of 21 and 50 were required to complete a questionnaire detailing their whereabouts on the dates of each abduction, along with the names and addresses of the persons who would confirm their whereabouts. When that did not come up with any leads, investigators returned to the abduction and attempts to take the life of Julia Taylor, focusing on each man previously involved in the case and cross-checking his name with subsequent investigations to determine if he warranted re-investigation. That initiative lasted several weeks when investigator Patrick Molloy discovered an inherent weakness in the criteria for identifying individuals with an alibi. Although several men were questioned in the connection with the cases, only a handful of these individuals were later questioned. Only some of them had confirmed alibis to eliminate them as suspects. The records of many others simply read as alibied by wife only. Until the spring of 1968, investigators searching for the criminal firmly believed that the perpetrator had been interviewed before, but because he relied on a spouse or family member as an alibi, he had been cleared from the records as a suspect, simply marked as no further action. All documents requiring further investigation were re-examined, although by mid-October most investigators were exhausted and the number of full-time investigators assigned to the case had dwindled to about 40. On November 4th, 1968, a 10-year-old girl named Margaret Alton narrowly escaped an attempted abduction in Walsall. A man chatted with her as she was putting logs on a fire. Margaret later recalled that the man drove to a nearby garage before asking if she would like to take some sparklers from the passenger seat of his car. Approaching the vehicle, the girl noticed that there was a newspaper on the passenger seat and there were no fireworks, so she hesitated. In response, the individual tried to drag her into his vehicle. The child managed to break free and escape when her would-be captor spotted 18-year-old Wendy Lane leaving a fish and chip shop across the street, causing him to run away from the scene, head down. Wendy had witnessed the events. She remembers the make, a green Ford with a cream roof and license plate of the vehicle. Why are you biting me? 429 LOP, which she gave to police. No such vehicle registration existed, but detectives investigated several possibilities and found that a green and cream Ford with the registration number 492 LOP held by a local. That vehicle was registered to a 39-year-old man named Raymond Leslie Morris, who lived in a flat on Green Lane directly opposite Walsall Police Station. Morris was arrested in connection with the attempted abduction of Alton the following morning. He denied knowledge of the incident but told detectives he only bought the car last year because he previously owned a gray Austin A55. Although at a police lineup, Wendy could not identify him, which led to his release. 2 investigators were struck by his uncanny resemblance to the 1967 composite drawing, and he admitted to owning an Austin A55. They conveyed their suspicions to their supervisor. A review of Morris's records revealed that he was questioned 4 times in 1964. Don't nip at me. You're mean. In 1968 in connection with previous abductions and was initially considered a strong suspect. Each time, his wife provided the authorities with an alibi about his whereabouts. Therefore, his file was simply marked alibied by wife only. No further action was taken. Although 2 police officers who interviewed Morris as part of a renewed door-to-door investigation on February 29th, 1968 commented on a questionnaire Morris filled out to investigators. Very good likeness to the composite sketch, unsatisfactory alibi. An investigation of Morris's insurance records revealed that he owned an Austin A55, which he sold in November 1965. At the time, the crimes committed against Julia and Margaret Reynolds, in addition to gas station receipts, placed him in certain locations during the abductions. For example, on the day of Margaret's abduction, he was driving a green company-issued car and was tasked with visiting an Ashton dealership that day. A review of time cards at the factory where Morris worked showed he left at 1:13 p.m. August 19th, 1967. These events prompted investigator Patrick Malloy to remark to his colleagues, "I think we've found the bastard." On November 15th, Morris was arrested again while driving to work. He was told that his arrest was related to the passing of Christine Garvey. In response, Morris simply said, "Oh my God, is it my wife?" He was taken to the police station to await questioning. Within hours of Morris's arrest, his wife was taken into custody for questioning. She was interviewed at a different police station to reveal the truth about her husband's whereabouts during key days of the investigation. At first, Carol Morris was adamant that her statements were true and that her husband returned home around 2 p.m. on the day of Christine's abduction. But within hours, she admitted that she had given her husband a false alibi and added that on the day of the crime, Morris did not return to their house until almost 5 p.m., explaining that he and his boss had been working late. He then drove her car to Warsaw to collect cakes for her mother, arriving shortly before closing time. Her parents quickly confirmed this revised account of his actions. Morris was confronted with statements from his wife and in-laws about the time of his actions on the evening of November 15th, the day of Christine's abduction. He became distraught but quickly calmed down, often refusing to answer questions. He also refused to participate in an identity lineup. In response, the police brought an eyewitness, Victor Whitehouse, to the station the next morning. Whitehouse identified Morris as the man he saw on the day of the crime, prompting Morris to ask an attorney to represent him. The Austin A55 was quickly located, and the person to whom Morris sold the vehicle was located. The car was impounded until a forensic examination was conducted. A police search of Morris's apartment turned up a small stash of homemade illegal adult content. Many of those images featured the same young girl, later identified as Carol's 5-year-old niece. The background of several photographs revealed that they were taken in the apartment itself. Although Morris's face was not depicted in any of the images, a distinctive watch visible in several images had been discovered strapped to his ankle the previous day. By photographing Morris's hands and forearms in the same positions as the photographs, investigators were able to match several scars upon his hands, those visible upon the subject, interfering with the child in the photographs. On November 17th, Morris was formally charged with taking the life of Christine. By December, he had also been charged with 2 counts of harming his niece and another charge of the attempted abduction of Margaret Alton. Prior to Morris's arrest, the police carried out house-to-house inquiries at more than 39,000 homes, interviewed about 80,000 people, and checked over 1 million car forms to identify the criminal. On February 10th, 1969, Morris was charged with taking the life of Christine Darby, 2 counts of harming his niece, and in the attempted abduction of Margaret Alton. He pleaded not guilty to kidnapping and taking someone's life, but pleaded guilty to harming his niece. He was acquitted on the first day of his trial. The judge ruled that Morris could be tried on all 3 counts simultaneously. On the second day of the trial, 2 of the main prosecution witnesses, Victor Whitehouse and Janine Rawlings, gave eyewitness accounts of the man they saw in Cannock Chase on October 19th, 1967. Morris's defense attorney asked him to stand before the court, handing out the composite sketch, asking to compare the composite to Morris as he physically appeared in the courtroom, asking, "It doesn't bear very much resemblance to Morris, does it?" Both witnesses disagreed, and Whitehouse concluded his testimony by saying, "I think if I had to see Mr. Morris walking across the street any time after August 1967, I would have picked him out." Rawlings also said that the person she saw on that date in Cannock Chase is the gentleman sitting in the dock. On February 14th, police officer Brian Porter testified about the remark Morris made during a house-to-house search conducted in the months after the crime committed against Christine. Porter testified that Morris, the father of 2 children, expressed frustration in repeated interviews, adding that he knew the police had a job to do, but because he had no children of his own, he could not imagine how Christine's mother must feel about losing her daughter. Although Morris's defense lawyer tried to argue that those words were not said, Porter simply replied, "They were said, sir." Carol Morris then testified for the prosecution. She first described her husband's typical route to and from work, which, contrary to his official statements to the police, took him in close proximity to streets where the girls went missing. She then retracted the statements she had originally made to investigators that day. They went shopping on the day of the crimes and stated that on both days the two were interviewed by the police regarding the whereabouts of her husband. She agreed to corroborate her husband's testimony because she didn't think he could be responsible. Carol then testified that her husband did not return home until the early evening, and his behavior was not normal that day, and that on the day of Margaret's attempted abduction, her husband did not return home until the closing credits of the soap opera she was watching. She also stated her willingness to give her husband a false alibi every time because she was convinced her husband could not be responsible for the crimes. Morris's mother-in-law then corroborated her daughter's statements about returning home after 5 p.m. on the day of the abduction, adding that her son-in-law explained the reason they were late was because he had to stay at work to tell his boss what happened at his workplace while his boss was on vacation. Her husband then testified that the time his daughter and son-in-law arrived at his house was at the end of the weekend football score show, which always started at 5 p.m. That testimony followed that Morris's employer, who produced his time cards on those days, both revealed that he left work with significant time to commit both crimes. Morris gave evidence in his own defense. He denied ever meeting Christine Darby or being near Cannock Chase that day. He also challenged his wife's attempted testimony about the time he returned home, claiming that her new statement was false and probably the result of police coercion. Morris claimed in his statements that after his arrest, he was during police interrogation, that he was not offered an opportunity to participate in an identification lineup, and he only remained silent with the police after he was told his wife wanted nothing further to do with him. Morris was asked about the revealing images of his 5-year-old niece and claimed that the photos were taken innocently shortly before the child accidentally exposed herself as she fell backwards on the bed. He also claimed he was disgusted by having taken the photos, and he was unsure why he did. The judge cautioned jurors against convicting Morris of the abductions out of anger over the adult images entered into evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours on the afternoon of February 18th before reaching a verdict at 4:28 p.m. Morris was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. The judge simply informed him, "I do not intend to keep you long or make any comment about this terrible crime. There is only one sentence, as you know, life imprisonment." After receiving this sentence, Morris turned to the public gallery. He briefly glared coldly in his wife's direction before he was led from the court to begin his life sentence, as several members of the public repeatedly shouted insults and threats such as "hang him."